Good evening, everyone. I am Felice Levine, Executive Director of the American Educational Research Association, and on behalf of AERA, I want to welcome all of you for joining us here at Benaroya Hall, this fabulous location, and those of you who can't be with us in person, for joining us with the online web streaming, to our second AERA Centennial Lecture and Open Forum. For those of you who are tweeting, which I will not do right at this moment, the hashtag is AERA Lectures. And as a courtesy to all of our speakers, commentators, those of you who will be participating from the audience, we ask that you silence your cell phones and enjoy the evening with us. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with AERA, the American Educational Research Association was founded in 1916, and we are celebrating our centennial year. AERA is the national, scholarly, and scientific society dedicated to advancing knowledge about education, to encouraging scholarly inquiry related to education, and to promoting the use of research to improve education and serve the public good. The Centennial Lecture Series is a key component of AERA's centennial celebration and into our second century beyond. These lectures and open forums bring innovative education research and leading scholars to 6 cities in the United States this year. The lecture series very much reflects AERA's commitment to promoting public engagement and connecting education research on significant issues to wide public and policy audiences across the country. The AERA Centennial Lecture Series would not be possible without the generous support of, in particular, the Spencer Foundation. Thank you to our friends at the Spencer Foundation for ongoing generosity, support, and a shared commitment to this form of outreach and public engagement. We are thrilled to be here in Seattle this evening. Those of you present or connecting virtually are in for a treat. Dr. Bruce McCandless will present the second lecture on the important topic of early education and the brain, making novel connections. It is appropriate for a city known for innovation across sectors from technology to health to the arts, and for the deep commitment to educational excellence to be the site of this topic and our second lecture. After Dr. McCandless's brief lecture, he will be joined in our living room setting. So imagine the living room coming alive after the lecture, with our moderator and 3 experts, not only expert in this issue, but also expert in the Seattle area. They will make initial remarks to kick off the conversation, but we very much want those in the audience to feel part of our living room and the open discussion. An important aim of this lecture, indeed, is to connect research to policy and practice considerations in the community. So simply put, we want to hear from you about your experiences as educators, parents, leaders of organizations, researchers struggling with what next, so that we can better understand how to take that research and translate it into policies and practices that matter right here. A few words about Dr. McCandless. He is one of the nation's leading scholars in developmental cognitive behavior. He is the head of the Educational Cognitive Neuroscience Laboratory at Stanford University, where he is professor in the Graduate School of Education and the Department of Psychology. His research uses the tools of developmental cognitive neuroscience to study individual differences and educational transformations in key cognitive skills, such as attention, literacy, and mathematics. In 2007, he was awarded the U.S. Presidential Early Career Award in Science and Engineering for his work in linking early literacy interventions to brain mechanisms But let me not go further on in the introduction when, in the words of Dr. McCandless, you can learn both about his research and his own story firsthand. Dr. McCandless.
Well, thank you so much for that gracious introduction. I'm really excited to be here. In my heart, what I really want to talk about tonight and connect with people is this struggle that I've had in my career to connect two really, really different worlds that I've been involved in, each of which I care about deeply. As a graduate student and as a scientist, I fell in love with studying the brain, particularly this idea that there's an emerging sense in neuroscience that our neural systems are changed by our experiences. This notion of experience-dependent brain plasticity, that most profound learning experiences that we have are actually rewiring our brain circuits, and by learning and rewiring the brain circuits, the mind can potentially do things that it couldn't do before. I fell in love with this idea. I said, I'm going to work on this the rest of my life. I couldn't imagine a more exciting idea to work on. But at the same time, when I wasn't in the lab working as a scientist, I was trekking across the city of Pittsburgh and trekking across the city of New York and working as a reading tutor. And in my work as a reading tutor, I came face to face with children that were struggling profoundly with the challenges, the earliest challenges of education, of learning to read. And it was heartrending to hear them talk about the challenges they faced when they realized their minds couldn't do something that all of their peers could do and that was expected of them. And realizing it as an adult, what a profound impact this was going to have on the rest of their life trajectory if they weren't able to break into literacy. And what I want to do tonight is to kind of explore ways in which we could potentially connect these two worlds. And we're living in a time of developmental cognitive neuroscience where I think we might start to get some answers to taking a brain science approach to the struggle of the transformation from pre-reader to expert reader that might give us some clues to understand what's going on with a child that's struggling so profoundly with reading. Can we start to understand that in new ways? And also, what are the powerful tools that we can use to support those children so that they can break into literacy and change these brain mechanisms that support one of these profound skills? Luckily, I was coming into this world of research at a very special time. It is now possible to use very safe, non-invasive neuroimaging techniques, not just to study the human brain as if it's a clock, and to map particular functions onto particular brain systems, and to come up with this mapping of cognition is supported by systems and circuits, and we can map them out and understand them in great detail. But instead, we can start to image children as they're developing. As the educated mind is developing over the course of elementary school, we can now image children as they go through this journey and witness the transformations that happen in cognition and the transformations that happen in their brain organization. And I'd like to show a quick video here, if I can cue that up. This is kind of what it looks like in the lab that I work in, where we work with children. It's about to start, I promise.
Okay, all right, so you can lean back. So remember, what's the most important thing about getting your brain picture taken? Stay still. That's right, I want you to be still like a statue.
So we can start to eavesdrop on the structure and functions of their brain as they do different mental gymnastics in the scanner. We can map those on to various regions, and we can study all forms of cognition. But one form of cognition that I want to talk to you about today specifically is one that has a very special relationship with education. This is not something which typically develops in the human species or in the human mind or brain, and that is the advent of literacy. One of the reasons why this is thought not to be a natural development of the human mind and human brain is that it's actually based on a very remarkable and creative cultural invention, which is only about 6,000 years old, and it's only for the last 100 years or so that we've expected everybody to take advantage of this very creative invention. So what's so creative about this invention? of the phonetic alphabet, which has transformed the world, has transformed societies, and maybe even transformed the educated mind. One of the most creative aspects of it is that people were able to invent individual cultural symbols that could be characteristically recognized by everybody if your handwriting was good or if your chiseling writing was good. But that in itself wasn't the most creative part of it. The most creative part about this invention is that the meanings of each of these symbols was mapped to a creative reanalysis of speech. The codes that these symbols code to are little elementary sounds that are buried within syllables that we speak. And we have to train our minds to access each one of those elementary speech sounds within syllables, and this is the code of the phonetic alphabet. So, what use of these insights could we have by taking a brain science approach? By imaging the human brain and watching the transformational journey from pre-reader to expert reader, we can start to get a couple of key insights, a general framework of the typical development of the brain. And one of the things that's been discovered is really kind of remarkable. We don't just invent a brand new circuit in the brain, but we actually construct a circuit out of pre-existing parts. So we can trace out changes that occur in the visual system. There are learning-related brain changes that occur that allow us to master the visual features of our native script. We can detect these and we can image the difference between somebody looking at a native piece of their script versus a non-native piece of their script. They lead to brain differences. We know they're experience dependent in their rewiring. But more profoundly, we can also look at another region of the brain which is crucially involved in the second part of mastering the Phoenician alphabet, or the phonetics of alphabetic reading. And that are these left hemisphere regions that allow us to analyze speech sounds. And not just hear the speech sounds, but analyze the parts buried within the syllables that we have to train our brain to extract. And there are profound changes that occur that we can map out over the course of learning to read in these brain circuits, which are experience-dependent changes in these circuits. But one of the things that is most remarkable about this circuit is that late in life, when children start to master this system and they start to use it for hundreds and hundreds of hours, there's a remarkable change that occurs. Novel connections are formed between these two systems, and they become integrated into what we call the reading circuit. This reading circuit is what supports in the brain our ability to dive into a novel and get an experience that's so immersive, it's almost like the very first form of virtual reality. The brain is able to take each one of these symbols and, in less than a blink of an eye, take one out of what might be 50,000 potential visual features in the visual word recognition system and map it directly and explicitly to, whoops, one back, I hit the wrong button. Directly and specifically to the pronunciation in the mind of that specific word. And this all happens when I say the blink of an eye. I mean, literally, a human eye blinks in about 1/5 of a second. And in that time, your integrated circuit that supports fluent reading has told your mind exactly what word that is, and you can move on to the next and chaining this together, engage in fluent literacy. So this, I think, is a great achievement in science. We've started to understand a brand new skill, a brand new educated skill, and how it's constructed in the human mind and how it typically develops as you go from being a pre-reader to a skilled reader. But I think this is just where the story begins to get really interesting and starts to make novel connections, meaningful connections, to discussions with education research. Knowing where the circuit is in a sense kind of like explaining to somebody how the carburetor of a car works. It doesn't change the way they're going to drive or use the car or anything. What I think is most powerful about these tools, actually there's two themes that I'd like to bring up, but let me focus on the first theme, not to fill your working memory too much too early. The first theme is, imagine that instead of talking about the human brain in the generic sense, as if we all have exactly the same one and it all works exactly the same way, neuroimaging is starting to show us that children's brains differ in important ways. There are large differences between children in terms of how their speech centers are organized and how difficult of a time they have pulling these elementary speech sounds out of their language systems. And some children have trouble pulling individual letter features out of clustered visual word forms. These individual differences in these pre-existing systems for processing features or processing elementary sounds within language, they precede learning to read. And if the framework here is right, that reading is built by integrating these two pre-existing, making novel connections between these two pre-existing systems, then these systems could spell big trouble for this integration process. So let's dive into this first theme. And I'd like to summarize the theme with a headline. And that's the notion that there may be brain differences that matter. We all know that it's a fact that all of our fingerprints differ and all of our brains differ in trivial ways, but there may be some ways in which one brain differs from the next that really matter when we go to rewire the brain to support this brand new technological invention of phonetic alphabets. So one way to study this is to go as elementary as possible, to probe the brain's function using very, very simple techniques. So a colleague of mine, Urs Maurer, designed a test that he could run with kindergartners in which he played speech sounds over a computer that repeated like da, 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 and occasionally made a very subtle change within those speech sounds, ta. So they would listen to these streams, and occasionally there would be a different sound that occurred. And what he was able to do was take advantage of the fact that we can surround the child's head with salty, spongy sensors that sense their brain's natural activity. And when the brain detects a change, there's immediately, within 1/10 of a second, a brain response that detects change. And we can examine how this plays out in kindergartners. And over the course of several years of work, one of his central findings was that there was very little difference in the way children's brains respond to this big change in language. The earliest reflex response made very little difference to their reading progress. But he went back in the data and said, well, what about a moment after the change occurs, when the child pauses and is able to reflect on that change, about 600 milliseconds, or a little over half a second. When he looked at the brain activity that surrounded the head, he found a remarkable discovery. He found that there were large differences in the way kindergarten brains, before they began to read, responded to these elementary speech sounds. Some children, like at the top, looked like this and produced a characteristic adult-like pattern, where a change in the phonetics of your language, these little elements, leads to increased activity in this left hemisphere language region. And much more so than the right. You see the center of activity is really over this processing center of the brain, which is crucial for pulling these elementary sounds out of language. And other children, like down here on the bottom, showed either very diffuse patterns across these regions or a strongly right lateralized pattern. Now, he was very curious to see, do these individual differences in the way children's brains are reacting to elementary speech sound changes, do those matter for learning to read? And remarkably, he followed these children for the next 2 years as they went through a very highly resourced, very successful set of reading experiences. And what he was able to show was a profound relationship when he followed these kids into 2nd grade, that their kindergarten brain activity actually predicted their success over this 2-year journey into literacy. And the central finding was that if you looked at children's reading fluency, the children who in kindergarten showed this left hemisphere adult-like pattern were reading very rapidly, up near about 100 words per minute. Whereas the children who showed this diffuse pattern, or even a right lateralized pattern, were reading much less rapidly, plodding along at maybe 25 or 30 words per minute, something that doesn't ever really approach fluent speech or immersion in virtual reality or any of these wonderful things we associate with literacy. Remarkably, This also held true for children who were born to parents that had dyslexia, and therefore they carried genetic risk factors, as well as children who were born to parents without in these open triangles. We also wanted to see whether we could investigate this basic notion that a child's ability to reflect on the sound structure of language, this notion of phonological awareness, whether it had a profound effect on the development of reading circuitry. And again, we took advantage of the fact that you can use neuroimaging not just to look at the generic brain, but each individual. How does one differ from another in a way that might matter for education? I carried out some work in New York City with a colleague of mine, Kim Noble, who's still in New York City. And what we discovered is we took elementary school children and put them in the scanner and had them read words. We were able to, in the group, pull out this characteristic reading circuit, this area of the visual system which is crucial for analyzing visual words, this area of the left superior temporal gyrus that I was showing you earlier, which is crucial for processing the sounds within language and co-activating them. But what we wanted to discover was, were there differences in how well the children did in phonological awareness tasks, like rhyming tasks or elision or Pig Latin, their ability to playfully engage with the sound elements of words? Did that predict the development of this reading circuitry in the brain? And it turns out we found a powerful correlation between how well a child did on a standardized test of just playing with the sound elements of language, phonological awareness, and how active their brain reading circuitry was, and the degree to which it approached what you expect in an expert adult reader. This relationship, remarkably, was the strongest in children who were growing up in low-resource neighborhoods, children with low socioeconomic status as reported by their parents, and potentially had fewer opportunities to focus their mind on this particular skill and develop that skill as they approached literacy. So we wanted to figure out, could we start to understand this really crucial brain difference of a child's phonological awareness ability and the development of their reading circuitry? So we started to shift some of the work that we were doing in selective attention in the lab, where we wanted to ask the question, could we take advantage of powerful insights from cognitive neuroscience about selective attention and brain activity? For me, as a cognitive neuroscientist, one of the most important discoveries in cognitive neuroscience is that we as goal-directed volitional beings can change our own brain activity. So right now, we can all as a group change our own brain activity if we decide for a moment as a group to focus on the sensation in our socks. Don't wiggle your feet or do anything. Just focus your mind volitionally on the sensation within your socks. And in doing so, there's a circuit in the brain that represents the human foot, and you've actually increased brain activity in that particular region of your brain, just on purpose, volitionally, by focusing your attention. And if instead you focus your attention on that sweet sensation of inhalation and exhalation, you've changed brain activity within brain circuits that control the respiratory system. So we have the ability to focus our minds and in a top-down fashion, activate brain circuits. So one question that we had is, maybe phonological awareness has an element of this, that you have to learn to focus your mind on language in a very new way. Ignore the obvious stuff, like I know you said cat, but now focus on the more subtle aspect, the less traveled path in the brain, to focus your mind on the sound structure within words. So we created a task that actually caused quite a stir in the research world, where we wanted to isolate what is the impact on human brain activity of volitionally focusing your mind on the sound elements within words by giving people a rhyming task, auditory rhyming task. And the only manipulation we had in this study was in one condition, we had you focus your mind on the words that you hear and tell me whether they rhyme, do an analysis of that. In the other condition, we asked people focus your mind on the notes that are hidden behind the words and give us an analysis of that. So by contrasting these two, we could examine what is the impact on human brain activity by just intentionally focusing on phonological information versus other forms of information. So I'm going to play you what these complex sounds sounded like to individuals.
Phase. Noise.
So in one condition, we might ask them, focus your mind on purpose, volitionally, on the sounds within words. Like in this, let's play through it one more time.
Phase. Noise.
And in the other condition, focus your mind on purpose, intentionally, on the notes within these words.
Phase. Noise.
And the question was, what impact would just this changing your mind about what information you're focusing your mind on would have on these systems? And remarkably, what we found was that this little manipulation had a profound impact on the frontal control language centers of the brain that are associated with pronunciation and cognitive control. But they also had a profound top-down activation of this circuit, which is crucial for activating the sounds within words when you're reading. And even more remarkably, even though there were no visual words present, we showed this top-down activation of the visual system, suggesting that the reading circuit was co-activated just by focusing your mind on the sounds of words. And this kind of underscored for us the notion that as a skilled reader, you develop an integrated circuit which is now calculating language and calculating visual forms of reading in a fully integrated way, so that when you think about the sound structure of words, you're activating your visual templates of letters. And when you look at letters, you can't help but have them shout out their pronunciation in your mind. So we thought maybe this is a tool that could be used in the process of education. Imagine that we could use selective attention to, in a top-down fashion of the learner, find a very creative way to get them to focus their mind on something that might seem incredibly elusive, the sound structure within words that they already know, or the visual features within words which map to those particular representations. And this question actually transcended the boundaries of what we consider cognitive neuroscience, because the question really is not how is psychology changing brain activity, but this is a question about how is it that an educational environment or a type of educational scaffolding that occurs in a learning environment might shape the way brain circuits are formed. This, in a sense, steps outside of psychology and into pedagogy and education. And this was really exciting to me because some of my colleagues were in schools of education and I was joining schools of education and becoming more and more interested in how does education change the mind and brain, and not just about the psychology of how we learn to read. And one very influential scholar who, I'm sorry to say, we lost recently, Jerome Bruner, was a pioneer in this field of connecting cognitive psychology to education. And he had a very powerful theory that changed the way, it was foundational for a lot of educational theory. This notion that educators can play a profound role by providing students with support in the initial stages of learning, that then they fade away as the children start to take over those skills themselves. And we started to wonder, what is it about an educational environment, a curriculum, interactions that could help scaffold selective attention to drive changes in these brain circuits? In a sense, we were asking, the question could be put this way: can the way a teacher directs attention impact the brain circuitry of reading? This is a question that transcends the boundaries of cognitive neuroscience. Most cognitive neuroscience couldn't tell you much about how education works and why and what the leading theories are. And this transcends the bounds of education because most educational researchers are just now learning about the brain. But I think that this question is one that fascinates me, partly because I'm trying to connect these two worlds. So one way into this question, first step, we decided to start off in the laboratory where we could kind of control everything. We could even create new writing systems that never existed before, new hieroglyphs. And we could ask people in the laboratory to come back again and again and learn to master these so they could repeat them very, very rapidly. They could name them, they could recognize them, they could do all these wonderful things. And we could examine what happens when we create a learning environment where there's an entire hieroglyph that you kind of learn as a shape or an object that you map to an entire word, and there's no scaffolding at all. And we can look at learning rates and the development of this skill, and we can contrast it with just by changing one simple thing. When the learner first starts to learn this, he could be paired with a teacher who says, when you learn this, if you want, when you want, it might be really helpful to like carve off the top part and treat that as a letter and map it to the letter sound in the word, like the first sound in the word. And if you want, when you want, you could pull out the middle part and map that to a vowel. And if you want, when you want, you could map this bottom feature to the sound within a word so that when you see this character in your mind, what you're going to be doing is linking letters to elemental speech sounds. The learning was identical in this experiment. Everybody learned all of the same characters. They learned them to mastery. They learned them, we could trace their learning rate. But what we wanted to discover was, did the educational scaffolding that was presented change the brain circuits as people learned this? And one way we went after that was by, again, using electrophysiology to present a stimulus and then have the learner surround the learner's head with these electrodes and then eavesdrop on the brain just a fifth of a second after this learned character appeared. This, in a sense, is trying to do what stop-motion photography has done for understanding water dynamics. So we could freeze the electrical signal right at the time the brain is converting this symbol to its word referent. And we could analyze what impact did learning have on this brain activity, and did the scaffolding make a difference? We found some very interesting results. So in the unscaffolded learning condition, people learned these new glyphs and they learned to pronounce them. They did quite well with them. They memorized them. When they were presented the glyphs on a subsequent day, the brain activity, a fifth of a second after they looked at it, showed this diffuse pattern, even perhaps a little bit organized towards the right hemisphere. Now, when we just changed one thing, when we introduced this scaffolding that helped people focus their mind on the connection between the letter features and the sounds, kind of like what an early reader does when they're breaking into literacy, we found a dramatically different pattern. Even though they were watching the same exact features and they'd learned at the same amount of time and all of the same contrast held, the energy that they produced a fifth of a second after they saw this, which is representing the reading reflex, was strongly left lateralized, suggesting an integration between visual feature analysis and these regions of the brain that are processing the elementary speech sounds of words. And this is, even though it was delayed perhaps by 10 milliseconds, this is exactly the topography we get when expert readers view the object of their expertise, like an English word. And this is very close to the pattern that we get when English readers view a character they've never seen before, such as Chinese. So what's remarkable to me is that this is kind of a new paradigm. This doesn't really exist in psychology, where the only thing manipulated is how a teacher scaffolds the learning process. And what we see is an example of this having a profound impact on which circuits are changing. Here, we see evidence of left hemisphere circuits rewiring with learning experiences, and here we see evidence of a more diffuse pattern, perhaps right-dominated circuits changing with learning experiences. And I think this is one kind of toy baby step towards connecting education and neuroscience research. We've also been very interested in going out into the field, into urban school districts like Pittsburgh and New York City public schools that are struggling profoundly with this challenge of helping kids to scaffold the process of learning to read, of breaking into literacy. And we've used a lot of these same scaffolding techniques of allowing kids in an educational video game to physically manipulate individual letter cards to form words and walk through progressive minimal pairs and have them pronounce them so that what is made salient is the impact of each individual sound within a word form, such that they can master really, really complex strings of minimally changing patterns. These techniques of focusing the mind on the connections that are elementary to forming the reading circuit seem to have a profound impact on children. We ran some randomized control studies in Pittsburgh and in New York City public schools. The first study was a university-based study where children were randomized to getting a lottery ticket to start the study right away or to wait 3 months. Over the course of 20 sessions, kids improved their standard score for decoding by about a grade level. And we were concerned that maybe this was just the impact of getting lots of attention towards reading. So the next study, we had all children receive tutoring, but we randomized which method the tutor used, whether they used a guided reading program that was common in New York City, or they used this scaffolding program to drive attention to these critical elements. And again, we found profound differences, a nice replication of about a year's worth of development. And we also started to do some pilot studies to see, does this program of focusing the mind in this particular way change brain activity? And we had some preliminary results suggesting that that was the case. But in the years that have followed this study, there have been a growing number of studies of the following design, which I think is making deeper and deeper connections between scaffolded educational experiences and changing in brain circuitry. I wrote a commentary for PNAS demonstrating brain imaging studies with kindergarten children that look at brain activity for letters before and after an educational experience. And the thing that's manipulated in this study is the design of the educational experience that they get. This allows them to powerfully link the scaffolding built within a video game where children are having to play Pac-Man to match phonemes to graphemes, by being able to contrast that with other learning experiences that don't have these techniques, allows you to do a very powerful causal analysis that this learning experience caused this brain difference. This is, in a sense, the era of a new form of scientific paradigm that can ask educational questions together with cognitive neuroscience questions. So most of the examples I've used up to this point have focused on reading, but I wanted to really sort of open this space up to see how similar questions and similar approaches could be expanded to many different forms of reading, or many different forms of learning. And so we've begun in the laboratory, and this is the last sort of set of slides, to start to look at a very different type of visual symbol, the Arabic number system, where children have to learn the significance of these particular symbols and link them expertly and effectively to very different brain mechanisms than we have for reading. Here we see a child who's processing the meaning of a number like 32, and we see intense increased activity in this parietal region, which is sort of above and behind your left ear. This is the brain's spatial supercomputer, which allows all forms of computation and comparison. Symbols become automatically linked to these brain structures over the course of effective mathematics training. They also are mapped specifically to language representations, the pronunciation of words like 3 and 2 and to the fourth. We can ask these same questions. Does the way in which a teacher guides attention during learning have a profound impact on setting up these new wirings within the brain? So one way we do this is, again, by doing this selective attention experiment. We have kids play a game in which they're doing a similarity game. They hear an auditory word like 1, and they have to look at 2 number symbols and say which one is closer in its pronunciation. So you have to think of the name that goes with this word, the linguistic association, and the name that goes with this word, and analyze the phonemes within them to say that, well, 1 and 9 are much more similar. And then we can just change the rules slightly to ask them which one's closer in magnitude or quantity, where they have to look at here the English word 1, and they have to look at these 2 familiar symbols, but now they have quite a different answer. So we can intentionally, and I think skilled teachers do this intrinsically, they find ways of focusing the minds of their learners on just the right information. And we think that this might have a significant impact on the brain circuits that are formed as a result of that learning experience. So what's the outcome? When we put third grade children in the scanner and we ask them to focus their minds in one way towards number names, we see just the act of focusing their minds leads to increased activity in left and right hemisphere regions associated with language and cognitive control. And when we just simply change the focus to ask them to focus their minds on the meanings of numbers, we see the same exact stimuli and the same difficulty of task and comparison suddenly leads to great increased activity in these parietal regions, the spatial centers of the brain, which we think are crucial for setting up the foundational representation of mathematical thought. These are the same regions which are activated when skilled high school students engage in algebraic tasks and symbol processing. And then finally, coming back to this theme that individuals' brains differ in ways that matter, what we've discovered is that when we look at individual differences and how much each child in the study tends to activate this region when they're focusing on quantity or when we ask them to, and how much they activate this region when they're focusing on the names of numbers, we just stumbled upon a really exciting and previously unexplored individual difference. The brain activity actually predicted how well they did on standardized math tests. The children who activated this frontal region when given the language challenge tended to do much better at math skills than children who failed to do so. And the children who activated this parietal region when given the quantity instructions, focus your mind on the quantity, did much better at math skills, standardized math tests. This is the Woodcock-Johnson calculation test. And remarkably, both of these predictors, when combined, just by knowing the brain activity when they focus their mind in these two different ways, we could predict about 55% of the variance in their standardized math tests, suggesting that individual minds differ in ways that matter for educational domains, but also the scaffolding process of focusing a child's mind on one type of information versus another might matter even more. And we think this is a powerful tool that actually changes the empowerment of educators. Educators have tools that can change the activity patterns in their students' minds in the moment, and they can also, by applying those tools over time, reshape the brain circuits that support two foundational aspects of education. One, breaking into fluent literacy, which is foundational for many forms of education that come. And two, breaking into symbolic automatic mastery of number symbols and number sense, which is foundational for precise mathematical reasoning. So we're kind of excited by these connections, and we're looking to expand this set to even more educational challenges and insights. And part of what we are able to do is collaborate with educators to find ways in which they lead to transformative learning experiences for children, and then use their insights as a new scientific method to study how the brain changes with experience. So just to review, there's three themes that I thought would be really interesting for starting what we're going to have tonight, which is a broad-ranging conversation. And my opening gambit to this conversation are three kind of what I call big ideas. One is that the foundations of education, those culturally invented skills like literacy and mathematics, which we don't think really even existed in the human mind 6,000 years ago, these are constructed through education. Pre-existing systems that the child already is endowed with when they're at the doorstep of education are reorganized. Novel connections are formed between what they already know how to do. Children are already experts at navigating the spatial world. They're already experts at navigating the linguistic world. They're already experts at recognizing thousands and thousands of visual objects. Education is making novel connections between these systems to construct new cognitive abilities that never existed before. The second big idea that I want to introduce into this great conversation we're about to have is that children's circuits differ in ways that matter. It could be a philosophical position that all students are the same, given the right motivation and the right exposures, they will all attain equal educational progress, but it seems that we're starting to discover that children differ in ways that matter. And this is creating new challenges for education to understand the needs of an individual child and maybe differentiate instruction to meet their needs. And then finally, this notion that I'm introducing tonight, educational scaffolding can change how circuits are constructed. This, I think, is maybe one of the most provocative. Teachers and who have expertise in pedagogy have the ability to shape the minds of young learners, and they also hold the tools for driving plastic, experience-dependent connections within their brains that can allow their minds to do something they couldn't do before. And I lied. There's one more spicy gambit and one that I think might be a little bit controversial and challenging. And that is when I think about what is the meaning of all this? What in my lifetime are going to be the novel connections that we're able to create across these communities? The most challenging thing is beyond just forming communities that study education questions and communities that study brain development research, and maybe the sliver of people like me kind of in between, that there might be the development of a new interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research set of new scholars that from the very beginning are finding deep, meaningful connections. They approach education as a causal force that shapes the developing human mind. And they approach neuroscience as a set of powerful tools that all educators are starting to become familiar with and they can apply to their research. And with those tools and with that sort of combined energy, we could start to tackle problems like this. How many people have read the New York Times in April of 2016? We lost the graph. Oh. So I encourage you to go back and look at this. So Sean Reardon has done an amazing analysis of state-by-state sixth grade reading performance scores. And what he shows in this is truly staggering. If you look at explaining variation in how well children are doing in sixth grade math skills, one of the biggest determining factors determining what one school district versus another, how well the children are doing on average, seems to vary tremendously by the socioeconomic status, just the education level and income level of the parents of that child. And within this SES, it seems that there are great inequities in our society in how successful we're scaffolding the development of reading circuitry and mathematics circuitry in the minds of our young children. And to reach sixth grade and be behind by 2 to 3 grade levels has a profound impact, all else being equal, on the trajectory of that individual into the future. This is something that we need to tackle with great urgency, and I think that we need all hands on deck, neuroscientists, educators, parents, and funders. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Thanks so much. That was great.
So I'm not lavalier, so I'm standing back on the podium, but Bruce has moved into the living room, and I'm working on my own scaffolding program here. I think he's raised both the big ideas and the challenges that we really can address as a community of scholars, policymakers, and practitioners. And we want to take this moment both to thank Bruce again, but really not break the moment, because I think most important is that we move into the kind of conversation that really Bruce teed up for all of us at the end of his talk. And so I want to just take a few moments to move us back into the living room and to encourage those in the audience to recognize we've got microphones at both ends, and we want you to participate in our conversation. But I want to first introduce briefly our moderator, Linda Shaw. assistant Metro editor at the Seattle Times, and likely in this very audience needs no introduction, but to those of you who are with us virtually, she has quite an impressive track record where she has not only been a bench journalist, but where she cares so deeply about these connections between the research and the knowledge base that's generated and reporting on that kind of work, that she leads at the Seattle Times an innovative project called Education Lab. And we'll be hearing much more about Education Lab, not in this forum, but I'm sure in the years ahead. Linda is not only a highly respected journalist within this community, but she's nationally recognized for her important work. She previously covered the education beat at the Times, having covered a wide range of K-12 education issues for many, many years. So I would like to introduce and have Linda come to the living room with the other commentators, and we will start our open forum. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out on this cold evening. Thankfully, it's not snowing, at least yet. It's really fascinating to me to hear Bruce talk about the ways in which researchers can essentially eavesdrop on children's brains, and the sense that teachers can have an impact on brain wiring. I mean, a couple years ago, it would be even hard to believe that was possible. And I'm eager to hear more about that, so I'm very pleased to introduce to you our three distinguished panelists, who will start by giving some of their thoughts following Dr. McCandless's talk, and this kind of research in cognitive neuroscience in general. After that, I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll open up the floor to you. So I'll start with to my immediate left with Erica Johnson. Erica is the Senior Policy Advisor for Early Learning for the City of Seattle. She began her work with the city in late 2013 as project manager for the Seattle Preschool Program. Now in its second year, the preschool program funds high-quality, affordable, full-day preschool for more than 600 children in 33 classrooms, and is financed through a property tax levy approved by Seattle voters. In her current role, she manages the development of programs and policies, evaluation, reporting, and strategic planning. Please welcome Erica. Then to her left, Sujin O. Park, who is an assistant professor in early childhood and family studies at the University of Washington's College of Education. She is a core faculty member of two programs, Learning Sciences and Human Development, and Education Equity and Society. She's also an affiliate faculty at the West Coast Poverty Center, and her work seeks to advance educational policy and practice that addresses issues of equity in early learning opportunities for children from low-income, immigrant, and non-dominant communities. And she studies the effects of early childhood programs and public policies on children's development. Please welcome Sujin. And last but not least, Brian Baird, who has served 6 terms in the United States Congress, representing Washington's 3rd Congressional District. He holds a PhD in clinical psychology and specialized in neuropsychology during more than 2 decades of practice. He is the author of 3 books, the former chair of the Department of Psychology at Pacific Lutheran University, and former president of Antioch University, Seattle. He has also chaired the Washington State Student Achievement Council. So please welcome Brian Baird. So for open remarks, let's start with Erica.
Okay, thank you. So I have a few words of appreciation a few questions about the findings that you shared, and then I'd like to share a few thoughts about the intersection of research and policy, since policy is what I'm here to talk about mostly. So first, the appreciations. I would really like to express my appreciation to the American Educational Research Association for bringing this conversation to Seattle, making attendance free and open to the public, and for selecting such interesting work for us all to discuss. Regarding this presentation specifically, I really appreciate that Bruce was trying to solve, or at least understand, a real-world problem. He was working with children, observed a pattern, questioned it, and used his professional expertise to learn more. I appreciate that the research has direct implications for daily interactions with children in the work of caregivers, families, and early learning professionals, as well as those who support them. The message seems to be that if a child is having trouble making a connection, make it for them in a detailed way, in a rich, detailed way, and make it explicit. I also appreciate that the research is grounded in racial equity. It deconstructs what is meant by the opportunity gap and possibly gives us some ideas about how to ameliorate it. His work encourages us to challenge anyone who says that a child just needs to try harder, because it's us, as we know, it's the adults who need to try harder. We need to try harder to understand child development. We need to try harder to develop equitable strategies to support children and the adults in their lives. And we need to try harder to question our own structures, practices, and assumptions to undo structural racism. A couple of questions, and then maybe some of these can be answered tonight or possibly in the future. Number one, so I guess looking at this, and I really was struck by how this helps us understand, well, what causes that achievement gap that we see at the 3rd and 4th grade levels. So taking it back a step, how early in a child's life are the connections between the visual and language regions of the brain apparent? And then thinking about the children who participated in these studies, were there other differences between the children other than their socioeconomic conditions? So a little bit of that, kind of that nurture question. Yeah. And it's clear that children who are exposed to certain interventions were able to improve by a grade level in some instances, but is there any evidence that they were able to catch up to their peers who had already previously kind of established those connections? And I'm not sure if this is going to make sense, but I'm going to try. Are there any benefits to not having this reading circuit established? So with all of the research that we talk about regarding adverse childhood experiences and trauma, is there some emotional benefit that we're maybe not recognizing for why that's not established? So, a little bit about policy and program development, and for those who are listening who have research that they believe has direct policy implications. So in my experience, when a city or government agency considers taking on a new body of work and incorporating some new research into what they're currently doing, there are a couple of questions that are asked. Number one, what is the evidence? Number two, is it applicable or feasible in this context? Who will be against it or for it, and why? Are there any implications for racial equity and social justice that need to be studied? And how much will it cost? And how will we pay for it? So, as researchers, if you really desire your findings to be seriously considered, having some way to work with partners across sectors to help answer all of those questions would be probably the best thing to do. In developing the Seattle Preschool program, we were lucky because we have early learning champions here in Seattle. The idea to work toward universal preschool came from our Seattle City Council, specifically Councilmember Tim Burgess, who ensured that the program would be evidence-based. And we also have a wonderful mayor, Mayor Ed Murray, who wanted the first years of SVP to be a demonstration phase or a pilot to allow the Department of Education and Early Learning time to develop and adjust to meet the needs of the local community and our partners. And I can't say enough about this decision. It recognizes that we're doing things that we've never done before because innovation was built into the program. And as we know, when we try new things, there's a lot of learning while doing, and then adjustments necessarily need to be made. And so thinking about this nexus between policy and research, I was thinking about the program that we developed and what research really came to the fore when we were trying to help everyone make decisions about what this program should look like. And I mean, I can list a little bit of the research, but I won't go into detail. So there's James Heckman's work about the return on investment for high quality preschool and the indirect benefits to the community, the work of Yoshikawa and Weiland and others for the Foundation for Child Development, the work of the National Institute for Early Education Research in identifying the quality indicators that matter, the work of Robert Pianta and the folks who developed and refined the classroom assessment scoring system, and then researchers at the University of Washington, particularly Gail Joseph, who has been supporting Washington State to improve quality in early learning settings for years. The thing that stands out to me about all of this research is that it was available to policymakers. I can Google it, or I can call somebody and ask questions about it, and they can provide direct information. Often, policymakers do not have the same level of access to peer-reviewed journals as academics, and we don't know what we don't know. To make a real difference in policy, research needs to be succinct, well-communicated in various formats, and ideally, researchers, policymakers, and practitioners would have more opportunities to engage with one another to inform each other's work. Finally, I'll return to a comment that Bruce made. Children's brains differ in ways that matter for education. It's a really insightful finding, but it really begs the question, is this game rigged? And if so, even unintentionally, what can we do to ensure equality of opportunity for all children, and what can we do to support equity within the system? Thank you.
Sujin.
Sure. So it's a delight to be here. As a researcher in the field of early childhood education, I would like to shift our focus a little bit back to the first years of life when these neural connections are forming. So on average, there are about 700 new neural connections that are formed every single second for the first few years of life. And during these earliest years of life, children bring the genes that provide the blueprint, but it really is the experiences and the environmental influences that dictate the process, which determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for lifelong learning, health, as well as behavior. I will also like to add that it's our experiences and environmental factors that dictate which circuits and which neural connections get more usage, and more it's used, that's when it becomes more permanent and it grows stronger. And with repeated usage, these circuits become more efficient and start to connect to other areas of the brain as an interconnected scales, as you saw in Bruce's talk. And at this point, you might want to ask, what are some environmental mechanisms of change that could enhance or hinder these neural connections in the very critical period of brain development in the first years of life? And I would say that serve and return, which is now widely known, but in developmental psychology, we call it contingent responsiveness. And basically, you can think of it as a tennis match of early communicative attempts, where in the first years of life, an infant or a baby might instinctively serve through communicative gestures, babbling or cooing or making body movements. And the caregiving adult, a parent or a caregiver or grandparent or whoever it might be, returns that serve in a very directed and meaningful manner. And it's that back and forth interaction, serving and returning and serving and returning, that literally forms the new neural connections in your brain. And this happens in a meaningful way, and I think there are some connections there with the specific the scaffolding process that you also talked about. But one thing that I also wanted to bring up is that another critical mechanism of change that happens in tandem to serve and return process is this idea of toxic stress, which now we also know very widely and commonly. And basically, when caregiving adults are not there to buffer the consequences and effects of prolonged activated stress response as a result of extreme poverty, abuse, neglect, or constant fears, even due to many other factors like immigration, for example, that will literally result in a child's stress response system to be set on high alert, like for good, which literally results in reducing neural connections. So as much as we do see these meaningful differences manifest themselves in neurocognitive abilities, I would also argue that we need to think about the social-cultural as well as systemic inequities, which provide the roots to explain the differences that we see to begin with. So I will just stop there for now.
Right. Thank you. Bruce.
I want to echo your appreciation for AERA and for inviting us here, but I also want to thank all the folks who are here. Many of you are educators, researchers yourselves, and you've taken a precious time of your evening to join us. I see some friends in the audience and have to get together afterwards a little bit and chat. But thank you, and Bruce, thanks for all your research and for the insightful presentation tonight. I come at this both as a former neuropsychologist, as a member of Congress, as a policymaker, but I think most importantly as a father. And somewhere backstage in the green room are two 11-year-old boys, fraternal twins, my sons. They're playing Minecraft. Hi, boys, if you can hear Dad. They're happily playing Minecraft. But Felice referred to this as the living room, and I want to take this back to the living room for a second, because I think at some point all of the research and the policy matters has to come back to what teachers are doing in their classroom and parents are doing in their homes. And the question that I kept asking myself was, okay, fascinating work, how do we translate this to the average person trying their best to raise their kids, or a teacher in a classroom with 20 or 30 kids, and all the challenges those children bring, all of them precious in their own ways. And so for me, I really want to explore with you tonight, Bruce, and learn from you your thoughts about how can we translate this for parents to say, okay, but what about my William or my Walter or my Alice or my Catherine? What does this teach them? The last thing, very briefly, is I had the opportunity this week to go with one of my sons to a Lego robotics tournament. And I had this not so profound insight, but it struck me a bit, that as I watch them, sometimes their robot just doesn't do what you want it to do. It would sort of careen around the thing, hit an obstacle, and flip over instead of deftly picking something up. And I thought, I feel so much like that as a parent sometime. I think I'm going to set this little robot on his course, and off he goes and crashes into a wall, and occasionally makes an amazing thing that he did mostly on his own, regardless of me. But your idea of how we teach children and how we sort of prepare them to learn really it strikes me. And how can we translate this to parents and to teachers is my main question.
Thank you. And I think that's probably as good a place as any to start. It was sort of my first question to Bruce when we talked before this forum. What are the upshots of this? Are there things that teachers and parents should be doing right now? Or are we all going to end up with brain scans of our kids and trying to determine how to differentiate instruction based on that? Where are we?
Well, so I see a very important connection between understanding things at the cognitive level and at the neural level. And I think that the two help us understand something on a much deeper level, taking a construct like a kid's phonological processing or their visual acuity or their learning rate or how long they can sustain attention. These are all cognitive constructs that we can now understand even more by doing brain imaging. But I don't think the answer is more brain imaging for everybody all the time or entire school districts lining up for the brain scanner to find out who's going to have trouble. But I think we can start to use brain science to sharpen our cognitive constructs to those that really we can explain in different ways. And one amazing set of discoveries that I think might have profound impact, and it's starting to actually have an impact at the state policy level, is this insight that children, even before they learn to read, can sometimes show signs that they're going to have tremendous difficulty, and that they're going to go through the first 1, 2, and 3 years and basically fall off a cliff when it comes to learning to read. And then around 3rd grade, we might send them to a reading specialist who says, oh, yeah, they're having tremendous difficulty learning to read. We should really put them on some sort of special remedial track. And this little vignette plays out year after year after year after year, and somebody might say, wow, couldn't we take advantage of the fact that these kids are showing clear predictive signals in preschool, even before literacy begins, that they're going to have tremendous struggles? One way to think of it is some kids are showing kind of dandelion type qualities where they're going to perhaps learn to read under all sorts of situations. And others are showing orchid-like qualities where only with the right scaffolding and intensive care is this child going to make it through this passage. Currently, there are studies demonstrating that if you test a large population of children at age 4.5 or 5.5 before reading instruction really kicks in, you can predict with 75 to 80% accuracy which kids are going to be diagnosed as dyslexic in 3rd grade. And there are new state mandates coming down the pike which are trying to advocate that schools start to become aware of these challenges and start testing early for them and start using science-based approaches to providing the scaffolding that these kids need. And I think that this is one kind of intersection between what can be done about it. If we can start to see the problems early and start to understand the integration process from a cognitive and from a neural perspective, we can jump in early and we can provide supports. Another, I think, really crucial insight is that some skills like learning to read and learning to engage in phonological awareness and rhyming skills are actually mutually scaffolding. So children, another key notion that Jerome Bruner brought to education was this notion of this spiraling education process where some skills are actually building other skills. And we can start to see this process taking off in kids, but when kids are getting derailed from that process, we can find ways to get them sort of back on track.
That answer your question?
It's a start. Yeah, I think it's a start.
Yeah.
I think that's the kind of thing. My father was an educator, and he used to say that, and I'm sure you see this, that one of the worst things that happens to any parent is when their kid goes and takes a standardized test, and they get the word back, your kid is below average, which is sort of by definition 50%. And at that point, 50% of parents feel terrible about themselves and about their kids and about the educational experience and about the future, and it's cascading. And one of the things I think your research might do, Bruce, is help the parents not hear just, are you above or below average, but more, this is how your child's brain works. This is how we can help them maximize the potential they have and be successful. And that I think is the challenge.
Yeah, kind of like a growth mindset for parents, as well as students. That segues into another question. I'll start out before we start taking questions from you. I was wondering for each of you, sort of, what did you hear tonight? What about this research really excites you? And what, if anything, kind of scares you? Anything that excites you?
I can start.
Okay.
I think the part that's particularly compelling for me is that we can begin to potentially link specific instructional strategies in ways that can promote specific neural circuitry in the brain. So we can begin to have more deepened conversations around what effective teaching practices are and for whom that actually work. And specifically in the field of immersion language and literacy, I can kind of see a specific example of this idea of selective attention that you talked about, Bruce, when I think about the domain of print knowledge, for example. So print knowledge is an emerging understanding of written forms and functions of written language among young children. And the reason why this is important is that studies have shown that constantly reading and high frequency of adult-child storybook reading does not boost print knowledge in and of itself. There is a modest association there, but it's not a strong predictor. And that's because studies have also shown that children and adults alike prefer pictures and illustrations over print, for obvious reasons. And among 3 and 4-year-olds, only like 98% of their visual attention is all directed on illustrations and not really print. So one instructional strategy that I teach for future preschool teachers in my course is print referencing. It's a very specific instructional strategies that teachers use to direct and guide the children's visual attention in a meaningful way to different features of print. So where do I begin to read? And I move from left to right. Or what is a speech bubble, for example, or pointing out environmental print and what labels are for. And we know that it's an evidence-based strategy, but it will be really exciting to see some of those evidence-based and proven strategies that we are already using and preparing for our future early childhood workforce for, and then linking that to the field of neurocognitive science.
A lot of what you were mentioning, it really reminded me of, so there's this app that I'm sure a lot of people, at least in the room, have heard of, Room, where parents sign up or caregivers sign up and they put in the age of their child, and then they get daily reminders and activities for things to do with their children. I happened to sign up right before my child aged out, so I don't have a full, I should have lied and said she was a baby, but she wasn't. But I mean, it was just a simple prompt and said, you know, the next time you have a conversation about directions, instead of just saying it, sing it. And it was all kinds of little like word games like this and the sounds and the tones, and you're so lucky I did not sing for you. But using technology to really help parents and caregivers beyond those who are in formal education settings, just little reminders of different things that they can try to help focus that attention in a way that's going to help develop those circuits. I think that's really exciting.
And I think that's a powerful general idea, that to the extent we as education researchers can start to understand and identify what makes transformative educational experiences, if we can study what master teachers are doing, we could use technology to whisper hints to lots and lots of people how to emulate those things that we know are powerful changes, driving powerful change in the brain or making for a very valuable learning experience. So I think that technology should not be viewed as something that replaces educators, but I think it could be, given kind of the right bridle, something that could actually make really useful suggestions and be kind of a useful partner for educators and parents to suggest things that they could be doing that would more likely emulate things that we know are having profound impacts on children. Wouldn't it be great if every child who is struggling with reading could be paired with one of the world's best exceptional reading tutors and could go through a transformative experience where suddenly they break into fluent literacy? Unfortunately, this isn't possible, but it is possible to study the dynamics of those expert reading teachers and to give the skills to everybody in a really low-cost way what those techniques are and what the evidence-based practices are that they could emulate.
Do you have anything you wanted to
I
yeah.
put something out there that excites me, and it's the prospect of brain scans for all. You know, my son, at his school, there's a big van that parks out every few months, and there's this wonderful woman, Kathy Bonoff, who tests his hearing, and she tests every kid in the district, because we've learned that some poor child who can't see well or can't hear well is going to have a hard time learning. Well, the technology, I love that picture of the little girl with the electrodes on her
yeah.
head. She's just
Very happy.
a doll. And I don't think it's that far off that we could have that kind of van that visits the schools and does a scan. You can go to a Rite Aid or a Walgreens or somewhere and get your blood pressure tested and all this other stuff. And the question for me would be, could we then link that with some kind of strategic learning approach that parents could use to truly get to individualized instructions, with the teacher being the person who somehow mediates a lot of this, but with individualized technology? I don't think that's all that far off.
I think you read my next grant proposal.
I want to follow up
bad
on that,
proposal.
but I want to quickly open it up for your questions as well. And I think we're asking folks to line up at the microphones, correct? If you have questions, so you can ask the questions there. So if you have any questions, why don't you start doing that as we're following up here?
I have a
guess,
question.
go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, were there ever any readings that you completely didn't expect? So you expected to see activity in the visual area, in the auditory area, but were there other things that were kind of unique to specific children that there is no explanation for?
Yeah, this happens all the time. I think that what I presented here as sort of pat and something that's cleanly mathematically related in all children is really just a central tendency. And we're just scratching the surface of how complex and different every single child's brain really is and what their activities are. And there are cases of children, unfortunately, if you scan a large number of children that I have, there are children who come into the scanner doing just fine in all of their academic skills, and you do an image and you find that there's a large softball-sized hole in their brain that's missing due to some perinatal abnormality. Their brain has grown up with this, they've adapted to it perfectly, and the neuroradiologist examines it and they do additional scans, and there's very little impact on the child and no medical intervention. But the degree to which that child's brain changes and adapts to that kind of like early environmental change within inside the brain is just truly remarkable. And so I think that we are just starting to really start to realize the great diversity of human brains. We worked with other patients that in our brain scanning in New York, I was part of a collaboration that looked at minimally conscious individuals who, over the course of maybe 10, 15 years of being minimally conscious, suddenly started to develop language abilities and started interacting. And the brain scans of these individuals is truly amazing. There are white matter tracts that are forming that don't typically exist within the normal human brain, and the brain can rewire in all sorts of complex ways. So I think it's still very early days for us to understand the complexity, and I think Dan Schwartz, currently the dean of the Graduate School of Education at Stanford, has this great quote. He says, "Novices study averages, and experts understand diversity." And I think that we're still largely at the stage within neuroimaging that we're studying the central tendency of the human brain. We're studying the average, and we're just now breaking into understanding how brains differ and the variance within these brains. And hopefully we can achieve expertise in this domain.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to you guys, but one last question. I do want to know if any of this gives you any pause. Any fears about where some of this research could go?
Conspiracy theory-wise? I mean,
No, just anything that gives you pause. If not, that's fine. Maybe, yeah.
I mean, I would really not like to see the day where you scan children's brains early in their career and decide on their path for the rest of their lives due to that. But you know, that's the conspiracy theory part of me that luckily doesn't come out too often. Yeah, I mean, you think about all of, like, you know, England, where they had the test when they turned 11, and that really determined their path for the rest of their educational career.
Yeah.
If it ever went in that direction, that would be terrifying.
Anything
I
else?
agree.
One thing,
Good,
one
I'm
thing
glad.
that I hope we'll also talk a lot about and study a lot is the emotional side of the cognitive process. I read a study that suggested that for some subset of kids, and adults as well, actually, when you tell them that they're about to do a mathematical problem, the same brain centers as are activated if I were to say you're going to be shocked, those same brain centers, truly, they light up as well.
Yeah.
And for me as a parent, that was quite an insight. I like math. I think, well, okay, this will be fun. But somebody else feels like they're going to get shocked.
Yeah.
And you can see that in the way they approach the task. And at first you get frustrated, and then when you realize, oh no, they're having a completely different experience inside.
Yeah.
And I need to empathize with that, because shouting about you'll learn to enjoy the shock is not going to work.
Right, right.
Or if we repeat the shock often enough, it will get easier.
Right. And that's also tied to identity issues in
Good point.
developing the educated mind. So you can have that same result by threatening somebody's identity issues by saying, well, you're a female and we're about to exaggerate your femaleness and now give you something that maybe females are stereotypically associated with failing at. That the very preparation process that occurs can derail brain mechanisms. So I think that part of what we're learning about and studying about is how is it that you help learners create learning identities that allow them to develop positive mindsets, that put their brain in an optimal information processing state before a learning opportunity. And I think that this can be derailed in all sorts of ways, and maybe can explain a lot of the variance in terms of how kids progress through education. It could be just like one or two kind of emotionally identity-threatening challenges put a kid on a dropout trajectory where no matter how many learning opportunities are laid before them, no significant change is going to occur. And I think this is tragic, and I think that this is something that science can get very clear insights into.
So there might be emotional scaffolding as well as instructional
Yeah,
scaffolding.
right.
Yeah, that'd be fascinating.
All right, let's open it up for questions. We'll start with you.
My name is
Oh.
Bruce DaCosta. I'm curious if you're doing collaborative work in, say, some of the European countries in the same kind of research. Some people are doing it in the same thing that you've done here, and how the difference of their cultures influence their findings in terms of what should work, what changes need to be made here. Do they transport over to other countries and other cultures?
That's a really good question. The sort of easiest way to cleave that question out is thinking about how the world approaches literacy. And there are profound differences in the way countries have developed their literacy technologies. So, for instance, Finland is historically ranked as one of the most literate countries in the world. They have a very sort of flat socioeconomic status gradient in terms of access to educational resources, but they also have what could be called one of the most shallow writing systems on the planet, where each letter maps exactly to a sound, and there's very little complexity in the mapping beyond just one letter mapping to a sound forming a word. And in these countries, they see very little of the symptoms that we see in English learners when they go to pronounce a word that they've never seen before. Their ability to accurately pronounce any word they've never seen before is something that nearly every child can do really, really well and really, really early. And it's the complexity of English which trips that up for a lot of children. Nonetheless, one of the most egalitarian and one of the shallowest orthographies, this country still produces about 5% of their population that are hardcore dyslexics, that have profound difficulties learning to read. And Finland has been studying these individuals by enrolling every single parent in the country who has dyslexia in a study if they're going to have a child. These children are studied from birth all the way up into early schooling, so they can start to differentiate the children who are born at risk, telltale neurological signs that you can record in the first 30 days of life that suggest whether they're on a path to being at risk yet becoming a good reader, or at risk and becoming, like their risky parent, dyslexic. And this has been a tremendous source of wealth of knowledge about how brain circuits develop in the brain and how genetic factors can play a role, and potentially might even open up new opportunities for intervening really, really early, like as early as age 4, with helping kids get the scaffolding that they might need in order to tackle this challenge for rewiring their brain for reading. The other extreme to that is, of course, China. So if you look at the Chinese writing system, there's vast differences between, it's almost the opposite of what the Finnish have, where half of each character is kind of ideographic together with phonetic radical. And by putting those two things together, you have to process information really differently. And there are some studies suggesting that there are different pathways in the brain that develop to master Chinese than for mastering English. So this is truly an international project that a whole network of researchers are taking on, and they're starting to compare the differences between different languages and different writing systems to get insight for that. And it's also linked to a problem that we have here at home, which is the notion that not all learners are coming to the task of learning to read English from a monolingual English background. This can be made incredibly complex for children who are simultaneously learning English as a second language and yet being challenged to master the writing system of English. And this is not a novel problem that happens at the fringes, but this is a problem which is happening in large percentages in a lot of kind of multicultural school districts. And there are new kind of confederations of researchers coming together to sort of tackle this problem of bilingual education and the challenges of literacy acquisition that occur within bilingual education. And I think this kind of brain science might give us some principled insights into that as well. I hope that answers the question. But we can talk more at the salon afterwards, too.
Okay.
Can we get the house lights up a little bit?
Yeah, so we
possibly?
can see. And please say your name and anything else you'd like to add before you ask your question.
My name is Isa, and I'd like to first thank you for your work and for AERA for bringing you here, and the panelists for participating as well. I have two questions. My first question is, given that learning is a cumulative process, and we see that these new circuits are being built and the architecture is there with scaffolding, something tells me that these interventions and scaffolding aren't available year in, year out past your interventions or as kids progress through grades. So I'm wondering if these pathways are degenerative or if you see that they're lasting or if there's any evidence of that. That's my first question. My second question is more a very basic methodological question. And I was wondering if you were able to parse out the relationship between the game as a delivery system for the intervention and the effect of having kids learn through a game versus it not being the effect of the game and it actually being the scaffolding itself.
Yeah, great questions. I think that there has been really, at the cognitive level, really great documentation of this kind of summer backslide that occurs in reading skills, and then a summer or a fall kind of catch-up period that occurs. And I think this is a tremendous opportunity for looking at the impact of education on these brain circuits, but I'm not aware of work that specifically tied these dynamics to sort of rises and falls of brain circuitry that supports it. But it's, I think, a really great natural experiment that we go intensely with this kind of instruction, focusing the mind in this particular way, and then we switch entirely to something else. And most of the principled things that we know about neuroscience suggest that this should be a situation that leads to sort of changes in these brain circuits. As you shift the mind to something completely different, it should change the wiring that's occurring. But it's something yet to be explored. And I'm trying to remember your second question now. Oh, yeah. So we did not do the question that you're asking. We did a different question because we know that tutors have a powerful impact on children, and we know that many school districts are championing tutoring programs as a solution for kids that are struggling. And so we did the sort of opposite question, of course, which was if you arm tutors with some guidelines about engaging kids with reading versus arm them with these particular games to help them focus. Combining the tutor and the game seemed to make a big difference for the kid versus combining the tutor with some other approach. So we held the tutor and the human interaction constant because we wanted all the children to be highly motivated, and just manipulated whether the tutor had the game or this non-game kind of approach to it. We didn't isolate the impact of the game versus the focusing itself. We did another study in which we really spent an entire summer teaching tutors all of these scaffolding techniques where they had to master how you create this entire literacy curriculum and how you engage kids with the scaffolding, and there was no computer game at all. And that was actually the first study that I showed, which was the university-based study where we trained all the tutors, there was no computer, and they were doing it all by cards and by interaction. And in those situations, we saw kids jump ahead, those 6 standard units or 1 grade equivalent in their reading skills. And then we replicated it with the game that we used the same principles. So I really think it's the method and not the game. And the real take-home question is, like, however you do it, if you can focus the mind in just the right way on just the right information, for many of these kids, you can drive really rapid change. Thanks for the question.
You know, Bruce, what I love about what you've just described is often in the social behavioral sciences, people ask, what's the benefit of basic research? And what you've done, I think, so beautifully tonight in your work is say, okay, so we've got this basic research about differences in how the brain processes information. We've got basic understanding in how scaffolding puts a new way of learning into people's brains and their technology, and then you applied it to the real world. So you can build the case of, we learned these facts, that led to this technique, that led to this intervention, that led to this outcome. And we do that too rarely, I think, but it's a very eloquent way of showing that.
I think it catalyzes science. And I think sometimes scientific research programs need to be told from the outside, what should you guys do next? This is often left to basic research. Oh, we can go 1 level deeper into this question, or we can test the boundary conditions of this insight. But when you see a partnership between an educational agenda and a research agenda, the question of what should you do next becomes really constrained to a couple of co-constructed areas that I think could make a change in both research insights and practice.
We'll go to the next question, but I would open that up to you. What should Bruce do next? Maybe from the panelists or from someone in the audience. Take him up on his word, right? Ben.
Yeah, my name is Douglas. My question actually was a really good follow-up to the question you were just asking, which is how, I guess in basic science, it's very easy to take the best known clinical intervention and use that and have very highly trained individuals applying that in a very small setting of maybe a few dozen individuals. Those studies are difficult to then perhaps generalize to a national educational level. How do we meet in the middle? How do we better replicate real world conditions in basic science research in order to find solutions that could actually be integrated in a classroom in the near term, rather than waiting for the basic science to be distilled over years of further research before being able to be taken by industry and academic publishing and education and integrated.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really important question. It gets to the heart of one of the most frustrating things about research is to see the research progress and dissemination go so glacially slowly when you see the urgency of the challenges we're facing, cohort after cohort of students, happen so immediately. And so I think that I struggle with that myself, finding ways of making these connections more rapid. And I have a hope that if technology could be used creatively, that we could have disruptive technologies that make widespread differences very, very rapidly. Most of the people in this room, whether they know it or not, there's a supercomputer working for Amazon and for Netflix that is tracking a model of you and your preferences for what you're going to consume next. However, there is no supercomputer working on the thousands of bits of data that every student is producing every day within our educational system, predicting what educational opportunity might they respond to best next. And I think that there's, by being careful, this is the scary part, there may be ways in which we could harness this ubiquitous technology that we now find ourselves in the educational sphere in, moving away from all of the kind of recalcitrant paper-based assessment tools that reiterate what they've learned one year to the next, to start to look at rapid light touch assessments that happen pervasively for the entire population of kids, and that use Bayesian inferences to drill down to see when do you have to test more in order to optimize a kid's learning. And I think that if we can do this for our Netflix preferences and for our Amazon next purchase preferences and suggestions that occur, I think that we could easily adapt this kind of technology to the challenges that we face as educators.
I think it should not go, I think you've raised a great question, and it shouldn't go overlooked that you have 3 examples right here on the panel who are addressing it, and sort of shameless plugs for each of them that deserve it. Linda's work with the Seattle Times is, I think, fairly unique in the country, to have a whole special focus on education and what works, and often very uplifting articles about what's actually working. And the fact that we have a policy shop for early childhood education in our city level of government is pretty remarkable, and you see the capacity and the capabilities of the people who are working that. And here at the University of Washington, we're seeing that kind of work. So we're pretty lucky to be in an area, I think, that really reflects that. And as you know, the Allen Brain Institute's been at the forefront.
Yeah.
So great question, and I think we should all be kind of proud that Seattle's got this kind of commitment and people doing this kind of work.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks again. Oh, this is a quite sensitive microphone. Thanks again to the panel for sharing, and this is really fascinating research.
And your name is?
TJ Walker.
Okay.
I'm a student at the University of Washington in English. And I guess what I'd like to say is sort of both an expression of my own sort of preoccupation with this sort of research, or my own. We've talked a little bit about some of the worries, and then also a genuine question. So I guess just to first express some of the things about this research which is potentially worrying, is what is the likelihood that it gets taken up by, for example, the graphic that you showed where it had whites in the upper right-hand quadrant as reading above grade level, and Hispanics and blacks and other minorities on the sort of lower end of the scale. What's the potential for that to be taken up by certain groups and used as sort of a racist justification for white supremacy? So that's a fear of mine, with this sort of research, is that when we take this sort of science, it can occasionally be applied by certain groups in really horrifying ways. So that's a fear. And my question you touched a little bit upon earlier when you were talking about students who were studying, perhaps, they're reading below grade level, but perhaps they're reading below grade level in a foreign language. So you talked about students who maybe, are coming to schools and they're not actually, they're not English language speakers, so of course, naturally they're going to have trouble reading at grade level. So I guess my question kind of ties into that, like, how much are we, and I'm sure this is a question that, has certainly been raised, but how much are we paying attention to the cultural biases that are leading to our results? So for example, if we ask a question, what's going on in people's brains when this happens, like how much are we looking at the fact that someone is making the decision to examine this part of the brain, and that person is probably rich and white rather than poor and minority, and so how much are these sort of larger social questions also being asked at the very question of the science. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think several of you might want to respond to that. You want to, Bruce, for a start?
Well, one thing that I think as we start to develop a science of learning, and we start to understand what are all the critical ingredients and scaffold that make for a great educational environment, and we can identify what those are, we can study them objectively, we can measure them, I think that we get a new insight into inequity that was maybe invisible before. If we just focus on some sociological construct like SES of parents, you get a very kind of bleached of meaning kind of view on a very, very complex situation. But if we were able to come up with objective measures of, the emotional tone and the stability and the invitingness and the sort of adaptiveness and dynamics of a classroom, we might start to undersee really profound relationships where many schools are not really offering sort of all of the scaffolds that kids need. There are large inequities that occur from one school to the next that we need to directly and urgently tackle those sources of inequity, rather than studying the patterns that those sources of inequity tend to engender on some groups more than others.
And I would like to just build on that point that there might be some inherent genetic differences in how individuals are processing information and how our brains process that. But as I had alluded to before, I would also say that many of these manifestations that we're seeing in neurocognitive abilities are rooted in deeper macrostructural and cultural factors. There are other fMRI studies that have shown that there are consequences of extreme poverty that have affected different regions of the brain and how the brain circuits are being formed, and because of the chronic stress system that has been activated, right? So when we think about that, we realize that many of these systematic inequalities, that includes racial discrimination or socioeconomic inequalities and on, actually have deep, lasting impact at our neural and neurobiological level. And I guess I do second your concern is that it could be misinterpreted to explain these differences as deficits or explain these differences as a way to justify, resource allocations or, how we perceive and think about one group over the other. But I think it's important to think about how to tease out some of these differences as being just differences versus differences as a consequences of systematic factors that are beyond individual or family's control.
Well put.
No. Did you have anything else you wanted to add to that? Or?
No, that was beautiful.
I think it's a safe bet that somebody will retweet that graph in the wrong way, and Breitbart might be a good candidate for that. But I think at the same time, there's abundant evidence and some very striking studies of when people from disadvantaged conditions are given the opportunities that other people are given, their potential to excel puts the lie to the notion that there's just something inherently flawed or weaker about one ethnicity or another. And so I think we have to push that information out at the same time as we correct the misuses of what inevitably will happen for I think, less clear motives.
Okay.
Hi, Connie Fletcher, State Board of Education. So I want to piggyback on the question that Erica asked. Is there a downside of teaching the scaffolding method to all kids, recognizing that brains are different?
Yeah.
But is this a best practice? And if so, if it is a best practice, why don't we put more resources into children that we know have the most difficulty learning, especially in those early years, the lower SES population?
Thank you so much for that question, because that's something I wanted to introduce into my talk, but I already went over, so I had to stop, hold myself back. But I think that there's been an amazing story brewing in educational research, which has gone beyond this notion of the reading wars, of what's the best way to teach reading for all. And Carol Connor and Fred Morrison and others have demonstrated that if you take a very, very fine-grained look at the children who are being taught, if the children being taught tend to score really, really high on things like vocabulary or phonological processing, and you track them over the course of a school year through kindergarten, first grade, second grade, when those children are placed in a teacher-directed, explicit, phonics-heavy course, their growth in reading is actually much slower than if those same children were placed in an environment where the child got to direct a lot of their activity about where they spend their time and devote their attention. And maybe there was a little bit of phonics, but it was sort of implicit. And so if you look at these sort of high language kids, they actually do much better in a child-directed, implicit reading environment. But the converse is also true. There are children who you can measure early on in kindergarten who show signs of really struggling with their vocabulary and really struggling with this phonological aspect of language. And for those kids, if you neglect to give them the scaffolding they need to focus on breaking into decoding and everything, the results are abysmal. Their growth is, for the first several years of reading development, strongly impacted relative to if they had just been given the scaffold they need. What Carol Connor's most exciting new research suggests that there may be a continuum of how much code focus an individual child needs, and that continuum might shift as they go from being an early reader to a skilled reader. And if you can differentiate instruction so that the child gets just about as much scaffolding as they might need to keep on growing, that those children go on the optimal trajectory for developing reading. So I think that we need to be adaptive in how these scaffolds are used. You don't want the scaffolds to be smothering growth of a child who could take off on their own. And I think so this approach that we've had of an industrial model of where we're just going to find the best bread slicer and we're going to slice all the bread in the bakery is not necessarily the best approach. I think that we have to understand that kids come to the threshold of education with a different balance of strengths and weaknesses. And if we can understand that child's strengths and weaknesses, we can help optimize their growth patterns.
All right, any other questions that are, here comes one, maybe? No? Yes.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Mina. Thank you so much, Dr. Bruce McCandless, for your talk and sharing your findings with us. It sort of made me think of what it would be like if there was sort of a biomarker for literacy development. And thank you so much for the commentators, especially for highlighting the contextual factors that affect access and neuroconnectivity. I really appreciated that. And I'm just really curious about the circuitry that you sort of found in your research when participants are doing sort of literacy tasks. And I'm assuming that you probably excluded participants who had neurodevelopmental disorders, and you probably only took like a neurotypical sample. And maybe this is more of a future research kind of question, but have you encountered or do you plan on trying to see if maybe some of the same like phonological awareness tasks can be applied to different neurodeveloping subgroups? For example, kids with ASD or like autism spectrum disorder who may have a different learning circuitry, and whether it can be applied more universally in that sense.
That's a great question. And I think that this sets up what we could think of as like a forward-thinking model of individual differences for education. The more we have direct, real insights into how children differ, the more we can start to ask the question, how should education adapt to those known differences? And I think the case of ADHD is a fantastic one. Rather than saying, we structure education in this way, which we know runs completely counter to what ADHD children can and will do, and then pathologize the child's behavior in school because of that mismatch, I think is potentially an alternative approach could be to find creative ways to say, well, if you start with these known differences, how would we engineer a successful learning environment that matches that child's strengths and weaknesses and challenges? And I think that, we are starting to kind of expand what we conceive of as education, where now sometimes educational content is being implicitly woven into action video games that kids with ADHD are readily playing for dozens and thousands of hours. There are alternative approaches that can be matched to individuals right now, with the two 11-year-olds in the back. So as we have really specific neurological insights into neurodiversity, we can start to become smarter about how we create education rather than just looking at the mismatch between what we typically do and how well this particular neurodiversity is going to impact that.
And sorry, just as a clarification, I said ASD. So autism spectrum disorder.
Yeah.
Not ADHD, but.
Oh, so I misheard
okay.
you, sorry.
No,
Yeah.
I was quiet. So it's my fault. But thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
I almost hate to do this, but I will. This says, I think we've kind of created that kind of quality interaction that we really hope to bring to each of our cities and in Seattle this evening on a very important issue, one that we could caricature as there's the brain and what's it going to do to us, or that we can see this as a dimension of persons that we can drive the shaping of the brain both in cognitive and socio-emotional terms, and we can also have the brain work for us. And I think that conversation tonight very much captured, both from Bruce and our commentators, and really from the questions you brought to this conversation, that this is a matter of importance. In a democratic society, when we shut down that knowledge production, despite sometimes the risks of what we know, and that we press for the important purposes of the research, the data, and the knowledge, and we do so, as every commentator underscored, that we do so and develop that agenda in interaction with you. And that's very much why we've been taking this on the road. So many of the discussions that evolved in our first lecture in Brooklyn really bore very similar kinds of issues and tensions and complexities that really you brought to the fore tonight. So I want to both thank everyone for coming. For those who have been viewing us virtually, you will miss the informal buffet and conversation that will happen subsequently. But I do want to invite everyone here and everyone viewing to our third forum and discussion. Save the date, January 11th in Los Angeles, when I suspect everyone here and joining with us will find that the conversation, I think, continues in very important and robust ways. It's a difficult time, we're all approaching the holidays. We've all been asking each other lots of questions. Lots of questions came up in this room today. And I wanted to sort of end with a bit of a message from the more impromptu, maybe to the more crafted. So I wanted to kind of conclude with a holiday wish, really, to everyone here, and those who may see this subsequently on behalf of AERA. We're living in a time when hearing and listening to all voices in every city, town, and community matters. The AERA series is about that, sharing knowledge and fostering discussions of how research can best be used. May everyone present this evening, whether present or virtually present, enjoy good holidays and be sure that our brains are working for us to engender more thoughtful, respectful, and insightful education for all whose lives we shape and touch. With that, I really wish everyone a wonderful evening, and please join us for the reception.